one of the most difficult issues in Revelation centers on the meaning of Revelation 20, where the saints are promised that they will reign with Christ 1,000 years. Three views have attracted believers in history: postmillennialism, premillennialism, and amillennialism. The issue of the millennium isn't of central importance for the Christian faith, in my view, or interpreting Revelation even. Disputes over the meaning of the 1,000-year reign have arisen because this is the only place in the scriptures where a millennial reign is taught specifically. Actually, disputes over the millennium began very early. Papias, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Victorinus, and Irenaeus, among others, were clearly premillennial. But Charles Hill has argued that there were early versions of amillennialism as well, though there is no direct mention of the millennium in the sources Hill cites. Dogmatic opinions about the importance of the millennium have bedeviled the church, especially in the last 200 years. And some have mistakenly teetered close to seeing it as a matter of critical orthodoxy. Still, strong feelings are hardly new. When Eusebius discusses the premillennial view of Papias, he mockingly dismisses his view, remarking that Papias was a person of limited intelligence. Thus, put-downs of those who hold alternative views have a long history. Postmillennialists believe that Christ will come after a time of prosperity and blessing on earth. The number 1,000 is symbolic, and the millennium may have begun at Christ's resurrection, or perhaps it is inaugurated at some unspecified time in history. In the American experience, postmillennialism is associated especially with the Puritans, but it's also been associated more recently with manifest destiny, with a secular conception that life will get better and better. Evangelical postmillennialists, however, reject such a notion, the secular notion, I mean, arguing that the world is transformed by the proclamation of the gospel of Christ, not through some worldly or secular program. Thus, the claim that postmillennialism necessarily endorses a political or liberal view of social progress is mistaken. In the history of interpretation, postmillennialism was, as I said, especially promulgated by the Puritans, and they definitely did not believe that a political program would transform society. If you want to read a book on this, Ian Murray's A Puritan Hope. So I read that book, and after I read that book, I thought, I really wish I was a postmillennialist. I don't know, but I was in a very good mood after I read that book, you know? So my purpose isn't to explain fully the postmillennial viewpoint, but to focus on its reading of Revelation. For postmillennialists, it is crucial to say that Revelation 19:11 through 21 isn't about the future coming of Christ, but the progress of the gospel in the world. The sword coming from Jesus' mouth in 1915 doesn't represent a word of judgment, but the message of the gospel that triumphs over enemies. The war in 1911 and the armies in 1914 represent the truth that the gospel conquers all opponents. And slowly, but surely, enemies are vanquished and society is transformed through gospel witness. The opponents of the gospel are removed as the Lord Jesus rides in triumph throughout the world through the gospel. In one sense, postmillennialists are similar to premillennialists in that they see the transformation of this world, of life on earth. Though they're distinguished from premillennialists in that they see the transformation of the world as taking place before Christ returns. That's why they're called postmillennialists, right? Christ comes after the millennium. On the other hand, postmillennialists are similar to amillennialists in that they see the rapture, the return of Christ, the final judgment, and the arrival of the new creation is occurring at the same time. In the postmillennial scheme, the binding of Satan in the abyss either begins at the cross and resurrection or at an unspecified point in history. In any case, the binding of Satan will become progressively clearer as the gospel advances in the world. Some postmillennialists take the first resurrection to be spiritual in the same way as amillennialists, and others understand it to refer to the spirit of the martyrs and the revival of the church. And postmillennialists see, per Revelation 20, a brief period of evil breaking out in the world before Christ returns. I briefly described postmillennialism, since few advocate this reading today. Reconstructionism, theonomy, most of them are postmillennialists, but that view has really gone down in its popularity. The most significant problem for postmillennialism in the book of Revelation is the interpretation posed, I think, for Revelation 19:11 through 21, which on the postmillennial reading does not and cannot refer to the second coming of Christ. And then I say, I've argued previously in these lectures that does refer to the second coming of Christ, but you didn't hear that. So that's all I'm going to say. I think it's pretty clear, but if you want to ask about that passage. So I'm finished talking about postmillennialism. We turn next to premillennialism, which comes in two varieties today: historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. Historic premillennialism is so named because it harkens back to some of the earliest interpreters in the church. And I've mentioned some of them already, including Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, so forth. Dispensational premillennialism has its roots in the 19th century in the teaching of J.N. Darby. Dispensational premillennialism teaches that there will be a secret rapture 7 years before the millennium begins. Space is lacking here to discuss the view of the rapture defended by premillennialists. I would argue that there is no convincing biblical basis for such a position. And then, so I'm just going to talk about premillennialism in general here. I guess my focus is on historic premillennialism. In any case, both of them argue that Christ will return before the millennium and reign for 1,000 years on the earth. Most premillennialists maintain that the 1,000 years is a literal period of time. But of course, that's not required for a premillennial position. You can have Christ reign on the earth for a symbolic period of time. It's still a premillennial coming. So other premillennialists that I've talked to say, the 1,000 years doesn't have to be literal. The premillennial view has a number of strengths, and many interpreters defend this understanding of Revelation 20. Some wonder about the purpose of the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, some critics, I mean, but premillennialists argue that the rule of the Messiah in history fulfills the promises given to Abraham and to David and his offspring about the rule of a Davidic king on earth. Some also point out that the depth of human evil is revealed since there is a rebellion near the end of the millennium, even though human beings have lived in a virtual paradise for those 1,000 years, showing in a new way the need for redemption. The following arguments from Revelation 20 support a premillennial interpretation. First, the words, "Then I saw," in 20 verse 1, indicate that the vision that follows takes place after the coming of Christ in 1911 through 21. Christ comes in 1911 and following, and then the 1,000-year reign begins in chapter 20. The two events, say premillennialists, should not be merged together. And this is confirmed by Revelation 20:10, "For the devil is thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were cast in the battle of 1911 and following." Nothing is said about the beast and the false prophet in Revelation 20, for they were judged at the second coming. But the devil is judged at the end of the millennium. Second, an angel descends from heaven, seizes Satan, and confines him with a great chain to the abyss for 1,000 years, 21 through 3. The millennium has to be after the second coming of Christ, that's 1911 and following, because the devil is the ruler of this world, right? John 12:31, 16:11. He's the God of this age, 2 Corinthians 4:4. The whole world is under the sway of the evil one, 1 John 5:19. I mentioned these texts a couple days ago. But the devil's rule ends when he's confined to the abyss, say premillennialists, for 1,000 years. Furthermore, John says that during the 1,000 years, except for a short interval at the end, the devil can't deceive the nations, since he is enclosed in the abyss, 23. On the other hand, when the devil is active, when he's thrown to the earth, at chapter 12, verse 9, we talked about that text yesterday, he deceives the whole world. The casting to the earth in 12:9 is distinguished from being confined to the abyss in 23. For when Satan is on earth, he deceives the world. But when he is shut up in the abyss, he has no ability to deceive the world. Premillennialists also point out that it makes little sense to say that Satan is prevented from deceiving the nations in the present era, since it is quite obvious that the world is still being deceived by his stratagems. Third argument. The souls which were put to death came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. That's 24. The verb came to life, ezazon, refers to their physical resurrection. And this makes sense, since the souls that were dead come to life. The same verb, ezazon, well, it's ezazen, because it's talking about Christ. The same verb refers to Christ's resurrection in 2:8, where we are told that the one who was dead came to life. Clearly, there, that verb refers to his physical resurrection. What makes this argument even more powerful is the statement in 25 that the rest of the dead did not come to life, ezazon again, until the 1,000 years were completed, 25. All millennialists agree that the rest of the dead refers to unbelievers. And all millennialists agree that they're coming to life, which is the same verb used in verse 4 of the martyrs coming to life, refers to the resurrection of unbelievers. You with me? So even all millennialists agree, well, one verse later it refers to the physical resurrection. But if the verb, I'm promoting the premillennial view here, but if, I'm explaining it, maybe I shouldn't say promoting, but if the verb came to life refers the second time to a physical resurrection, it almost surely has the same meaning the first time as well. And there is even more evidence to support this view. The coming to life of the martyrs is described as the first resurrection, 25 and 6. And the word resurrection, anastasis, as N.T. Wright admits in his book on the resurrection, in every instance refers to the physical resurrection. And I don't know if any of you have read that book. I think that's N.T. Wright's best book. It's a fabulous book on the resurrection of the Son of God. And of course, N.T. Wright's always a great read. You know, even I don't agree with him on everything. But, so Wright even says it always means this. I have a little footnote here, though. Wright says anastasis always means resurrection, but then he says in the footnote, but not in Revelation. So it's kind of interesting, right? Thus, we have good reasons to think that the physical resurrection is intended here as well. Ramsey Michaels, who taught for many years at Gordon Conwell, makes another observation that is pertinent. If physical resurrection is not promised here, we have no text in Revelation which promises the resurrection of believers, which seems quite strange, says Michaels, in a book that heralds the final hope of believers. So Michaels says, where's the resurrection in Revelation? If it's not in chapter 20, it's not there. Michaels says that's very strange. By the way, Michaels was engaging in a debate in this article with Meredith Kline, who I'll bring up later, if you know that name. Fourth argument for premillennialism, the duration of the saints' reign points to a physical resurrection. Since we are told twice that the martyrs will reign for 1,000 years. The accusative phrase, 1,000 years, refers to the duration in which the saints will rule. But it's difficult to see how this fits with an all-millennial or post-millennial reading, since many believers on those schemes don't reign for the entire millennium. What does it mean? You know, if you're born at the very end of the millennium, you reign for 2 days, right? And they say, well, that just can't be. The phrase 1,000 years is much more naturally understood to refer to the entire period of the millennium. Fifth, premillennialists point to Old Testament texts which anticipate the rule of God's people, more specifically Israel on earth, and conclude that these prophecies are fulfilled in the millennium. Of course, what that fulfillment looks like differs between dispensationalists and historic premill. I'm not getting into that. Many texts are included here, such as Isaiah 2, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 62, Isaiah 65, 17 through 25. Others that are often adduced are Ezekiel 36 through 39, Ezekiel 40 through 48. Many premillennialists argue that the millennium fulfills the prophecies in Jeremiah 30 through 33, Zechariah chapters 9 through 14, and we could go to other texts. Sixth, 2 Old Testament texts in particular are used to support a premillennial interpretation. We read in Isaiah 24, starting in verse 21, on that day the Lord will punish the army of the heights. I think I have a misprint here. And the kings of the ground on the ground. They will be gathered together like prisoners in a pit. They will be confined to a dungeon. After many days, they will be punished. The moon will be put to shame, and the sun disgraced, because the Lord of armies will reign as king on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and he will display his glory in the presence of his elders. So why is this text important? The punishment of the army and the kings represents the second coming, but they're confined to a dungeon. Did you hear that? They're confined to a dungeon. That constitutes the millennial period, and then they're punished many days later. So that's a very interesting argument. Another key text is Isaiah 65, 17 through 25, which promises the arrival of a new heaven and a new earth. Joy will reverberate in Jerusalem, and people will build, plant, and enjoy prosperity. The wolf and the lamb will dwell and feed together without harming one another. And lions will become vegetarian. No children will die in infancy, and those who don't live 100 years will be considered cursed. Premillennialists point out that this text must refer to the millennium. For even though life is wonderful on earth, death still exists. And there will be no death in the new creation. So, yeah, time out for a drink for me, because now I'm shifting gears. So, this will be very interesting on the recording. Maybe this isn't recorded, but if it is. All right. Now, here we go. A premillennial reading is quite plausible and may even be the most compelling. Still, I slightly and tentatively and hesitantly incline toward an all-millennial interpretation for the following reasons. So here we go. First, no other text clearly and specifically teaches premillennialism. And establishing a doctrine based on one text, especially a text that is apocalyptic in nature, is not advisable. It fits with the whole teaching of Scripture if the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment take place at the same time. For instance, if premillennialism is correct, the judgment of the sheep and the goats described in Matthew 25, 31 through 46 doesn't occur at the same time. The sheep enter into their final reward 1,000 years before the goats are punished. Such a scenario is, of course, possible. But it seems like a strained and forced reading. Furthermore, it seems strange on the premillennial schema that glorified and unglorified saints live on earth together, though we must admit that strange and unforeseen things happen. Still, one wonders how unglorified people enter the millennium at all, since Revelation 19:21 says the rest were killed by the sword that comes out of the Lord's mouth. The killing of the rest doesn't seem to leave any room for any other human beings to enter a so-called millennial kingdom. Premillennialists offer various arguments for the entrance of some unbelieving people into the millennium, but such arguments are hard to square with Revelation 19:21. Premillennialists often argue that the words "then I saw" in Revelation 21 indicates we have a chronological progression from Christ's second coming in chapter 19. But the argument isn't decisive, for we see the same phrase, "then I saw," in chapter 20, verse 4, 3 verses later. And the vision described in verses 4 through 6, as all premillennialists agree, refers to the same period of time, the 1,000-year reign that we see in verses 1 through 3. Thus, the words "then I saw" don't necessarily indicate a chronological progression. Such a view needs to be established on other grounds. The claim that the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, chapter 19, 1,000 years before Satan is cast in the lake of fire, chapter 20, is disputable. Some English translations insert the word "were" in 2010, which implies that's the ESV, the NRSV, the RSV, the NIV, they've been thrown down. The past tense verbs imply that the beast and false prophet were thrown into hell before Satan was. In fact, however, there is no verb at all in the Greek text. And thus the verb could also be rendered "are." See the KJV, the NASB, the HCSB, and the CSB. I am the co-chair of the CSB, but we did not discuss that text again, honestly, because it's just, we kept what was in the HCSB. I don't remember even talking about it. On this reading, the beast, the false prophet, and Satan could meet their fate at the same time. In other words, the account of Satan's downfall could could recapitulate the same events described in 19. Furthermore, a good argument can be made for recapitulation in 19 and 20. So both texts allude to Ezekiel 38 and 39. In Revelation 19, the opponents of Christ are destroyed by his word. And all the birds ate their fill of their flesh. 19:21. The birds consuming the flesh of human beings fulfills Ezekiel 39:4 and 39:17 through 20. We see another allusion to Ezekiel 38 and 39 and 28 and 9, where the nations come up to fight against the people of God and are described as Gog and Magog. That's 28 of Revelation. John is, of course, indebted to Ezekiel, who identifies the opponents of Israel as Gog and Magog. John says the opposition will be like the sand of the sea, Revelation 28. And Ezekiel says, 38:4, it was a huge assembly. So you see how those two belong together. According to John, Gog and Magog have come for battle. Or we could say, given the Greek, the battle, ton palemon. That's 28. And the battle here may be the same one described in Revelation 19:19, since the exact same words, the battle, ton palemon, are used. Indeed, these two references may very well be another way of describing the Battle of Armageddon, 16:16, which is also described as the battle, ton palemon, the battle of the great day of God, the Almighty. John informs the readers that fire from God destroys the enemies of God, Gog and Magog, 29. And this picks up the judgment of fire from Ezekiel 38:22 and 39:6. Both Revelation 19 and 20 allude to Ezekiel 38 and 39. But the judgments in Ezekiel 38 and 39 refer to the same eschatological event. So, Ezekiel 38 and 39, at least my argument is, they're not two different battles, it's the same judgment. Here I rely on Dan Block. You're familiar, I hope, with his massive but excellent 2-volume commentary in the Nikot series on Ezekiel. Dan Block says that Ezekiel 38 and 39 has 8 frames, which are to be interpreted as, quote, a literary cartoon, unquote, portraying one attack and destruction. The argument here is that Ezekiel 38 and 39 portrays in various ways the last battle, and the different scenarios represent the end in compatible and complementary and overlapping ways. Since John picks up on Ezekiel's depiction of the last battle in both chapter 19 and chapter 20, there are good grounds for thinking that Revelation 20 recapitulates the last battle described in Revelation 19. If that is the case, Revelation 20 doesn't describe a 1,000-year millennium after the second coming. Instead, the 1,000-year period is a variant way of describing life on earth and in heaven before the second coming. Another argument supporting all-millennialism is the texts that are typically thought to support premillennialism. But when they're considered further, they can also be seen to support all-millennialism. I'll consider 4 passages briefly: Ezekiel 40 through 48, Isaiah chapter 2, 2 through 4, Isaiah 60, and Isaiah 65, 17 through 25. All 4 of these texts are commonly presented as favoring premillennialism. But when we examine them more closely, they actually support all-millennialism. First, we will reflect on Ezekiel 40 through 48, which describes the building of the new temple and the regulations accompanying such a rebuilding. The goal here isn't to investigate the chapters closely. Obviously, we don't have time for that, but to make general observations. And so I have a table. I'm not going to reproduce that for you, but I have a table showing the many allusions to Ezekiel 40 through 48 in Revelation 21 through 22. So I list, 5 or 6. What is striking is that every single allusion from Ezekiel 40 through 48 is found in Revelation 21 and 22, which describes, you with me? Which describes the new heavens and the new earth. Not a single allusion from Ezekiel 40 through 48 comes in the millennial passage of Revelation 20. They're all in the new creation passage. I conclude from this that Ezekiel 40 through 48 is fulfilled in the new heavens and the new earth, not in the millennium. It does not follow from this that a new temple will be in the new heavens heavens and new earth, because that's what Ezekiel's describing, right? The building of a temple. There won't be a new temple, because John specifically tells us there won't be a temple in the new creation, since the Lord himself and the Lamb are the temple, 21:22. How do we explain what Ezekiel's doing? Ezekiel uses the imagery and the language of his day when he describes the temple, but the fulfillment doesn't occur in a literal way. Some might say that the temple will be rebuilt in the millennium, per Ezekiel 40 through 48, as a precursor to what will exist in the new heavens and new earth. Such a scenario has several problems. First, the teaching in the epistle to the Hebrews, where Christ is the final and definitive sacrifice, makes it impossible to believe that the Old Testament sacrifices described in Ezekiel 40 through 48 will be reinstituted. Some argue that they will be reintroduced as a memorial of Christ's sacrifice. But we already have a memorial of Christ's sacrifice, the Lord's Supper. There's really no good explanation for why the Lord's Supper would be replaced by animal sacrifices. Second, even in Ezekiel, there is not an expectation that the temple described would ever be built. Ezekiel 40 through 48 doesn't envision the building of a literal temple, for detailed instructions are lacking to complete such a structure, so says Greg Beale. Dan Block says, the description of the temple is not presented as a blueprint for some future building to be constructed with human hands. Instead, it describes, I'm quoting Block again, spiritual reality in concrete terms. The new temple does not constitute the rebuilding of the old one, and here I'm relying on Thomas Renz. The details, this is a quote from William Dumbrell, the details are not a plan for physical rebuilding. No blueprint for building the temple exists here, for vertical dimensions are entirely lacking, so says Calenda Rose Stevenson. The use of Ezekiel 40 through 48 plays an important role hermeneutically, for we see that Old Testament prophecies are clothed in the language of their time. And we need to pay attention particularly to how the New Testament understands prophecies to see how they will be fulfilled in redemptive history. Space is lacking to unpack every text, but we can see how such a hermeneutic applies to other texts that are alleged to be about the millennium. Our second example comes from Isaiah 2 through 4, which many see as a text supporting premillennialism. Of course, that's found in Micah as well. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. All nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways so that we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will settle disputes among the nations and provide arbitration for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up sword against nation, and they will never again train for war. Some think this refers to the millennium, since there are still disputes among nations, and there won't be such disputes in the new creation. But it is just as likely that Isaiah uses the language of his day to describe peace and salvation. In other words, this is a colorful way of saying that there will be universal peace forever. That is, in the new creation. If we insist on taking the text literally, it doesn't apply to the millennium either, since we are told that the nations will never again train for war, Isaiah 2:4. But such a statement doesn't fit with the millennium, since the 1,000 years conclude with a great war against the people of God, Revelation 20. So I'm arguing, actually, when you read that text, it more naturally fits in the new creation. Third, one of the most famous texts that allegedly refers to the millennium, premillennialism I mean, right, is Isaiah 60. Zion's light has come, her sons and daughters will return, and nations will come to Zion bearing gifts. So I have another table here. There are 7 allusions to Isaiah 60 in Revelation 21 and 22. Remember, that's the new creation passage. So we have 8 allusions. What is striking is that every allusion refers to the new creation. Not a single one, again, refers to the millennium. Some say, well, the notion of bringing gifts to Zion in Isaiah could only be a reality in the millennium. That's Isaiah 65, 11, and 16. But this text isn't cited, interestingly enough, in Revelation 20, but in a text which speaks of the new creation, Revelation 21, 24, and 26. So isn't that fascinating? I think it's fascinating. We should not understand the fulfillment of Isaiah 6 literally, as if the nations are actually bringing gifts into the New Jerusalem. So here's the amillennial take on this text. What does that mean? The nations are bringing gifts into the New Jerusalem. I think John is telling us that everything that is beautiful and lovely in the present creation will be in the world to come, but it will be present in a transmuted and elevated form. When my daughter was very young, we had a dog named Scamper, and she asked me, is Scamper going to be in heaven? He must be in heaven for me to be happy. And I said to her, must he be there for you to be happy? She said, yes, Dad, he must be there. And then I said, speaking to an 8-year-old, then he'll be there. So everything you want will be there. In a transmuted form, I could have said, but she wouldn't have understood that. So I just said, Scamp's there with you. So I'm looking forward to seeing the transmuted Scamper in the new creation. So anyway. Or else being rebuked for what I said to my daughter. Yeah, we'll find out. Fourth, many premillennialists also point to Isaiah 65, verses 17 through 25, which speaks of the new creation, and yet it also refers to those who die at 100, affirming that a person who dies before reaching 100 will be considered to be cursed. Greg Beale, in a 2018 article in Jets, maybe some of you have seen it, it's very recent, has defended in a detailed and excellent article an amillennial reading of this text. I don't follow Greg at every point, but I do at a lot of points. So a few arguments will be sketched in quickly. First, the text directly speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, 65:17. That's not millennial language, right? The new heaven and new earth, that's the new creation language. And thus it is most natural to see this text as referring to the new creation rather than the millennium, since it specifically refers to the new creation. Second, the coming of the new creation is aligned with a joyous future for Jerusalem, Isaiah 65, 18, and 19. And in Revelation 21 and 22, and verse 10, a new Jerusalem dawns with the new creation. So, you see the language of the new creation and the new Jerusalem are being put together. Well, that's true in Revelation 2, but in the new creation text. Third, Isaiah says that the sound of weeping and crying will no longer be heard in her, Isaiah 65:19. And the day of no tears, as Revelation 21 says, comes when we have the new creation and the new Jerusalem. Fourth, the references to death, this is the most controversial part, in Isaiah 65:20 should be interpreted in light of the previous verse, which say there will be no mourning or crying. If friends and loved ones are truly dying, there would still be intense grief, no matter how old one is. I suggest then we have another example of what we see in Ezekiel 40 through 48. No infants dying and people living to be 100, which symbolizes fullness of years, are tokens of paradise. The references to death then should not be taken literally. To say that no one dies before 100 is akin to living in Eden. But the text doesn't literally mean that people die, because there's no mourning. Fifth, we see in Isaiah 65, verse 25, that the curses of the old creation have ended, and thus the wolf and the lamb will dwell together, and the lion will eat straw like cattle. The promise of Genesis 3:15, where the offspring of the woman will crush the serpent, is completely fulfilled. For the serpent will eat dust, which symbolizes total defeat. Verse 25 is clear. No evil will be done any longer on the Lord's holy mountain. But if sin and death still exist, then evil continues. Since the curse of the old creation is overcome, it is difficult to see how we should interpret Isaiah 65:20 as envisioning the continuance of death. Because in Genesis 2 and 3, death is the fundamental manifestation of the curse. And the cessation of the curse means that death is conquered forever. Once again, we need to realize that the Old Testament prophets describe the future in the idiom and language of their day. And also, as Beale shows, there are a number of indications in this text which show that we should not interpret death literally. Many think the binding of Satan decisively counters an amillennial interpretation. Satan is cast to the earth in 12:9, but he's confined to the abyss in chapter 20, and thus banned from the earth. Satan deceives the world while on earth, but in chapter 20, the world is deceived only after the dragon is released from prison. While he is in the abyss, The nations are not deceived. The argument is a good one, but it isn't decisive. The reference to the abyss in chapter 20 should not be construed to say that Satan isn't active on earth. The language is metaphorical, just as Hades and death are metaphors in 6, 7, and 8. When we read the text carefully, we see that the binding of Satan is delimited. He is bound so that he would no longer deceive the nations, 23. In the Old Testament, the nations were deceived and outside the citizenship of Israel and cut off from God and the Messiah, Ephesians 2. Israel was God's special people, and the nations were opposed to God's purposes. Now the deception of the nations is removed, so that some from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation believe, 5:9. Satan still blinds the minds of unbelievers, 2 Corinthians 4:4. The entire world remains under his power, 1 John 5:19. But his ability to deceive entire nations has been removed. And the whole world is being blessed in fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, Genesis 12:3. Satan has been bound to the cross, Matthew 12:29. And it has been cast out as Jesus has been lifted up and glorified on the cross, John 12:31. The two pictures of Satan in Revelation 12 and 20 are complementary. Yes, he still deceives human beings, but he is no longer able to deceive the entirety of the Gentile world. And because of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, he has no grounds for accusing the saints. The binding of Satan will be lifted near the end of history when the man of lawlessness enters the scene and the mystery of lawlessness bursts into full flower. 2 Thessalonians 2. And then we will see a remarkable intensification of evil before the end arrives. The best argument for the premillennial reading rests on their understanding of the resurrection in Revelation 20, especially when we consider that all millennialists claim that the first resurrection is spiritual and the resurrection of the rest, the resurrection of unbelievers, is physical. Still, I'm almost done here, too. I think that's my alarm. Still, the all-millennial interpretation is actually quite plausible. Notice I didn't say provable. We see from Romans 6 and John 5, 24 through 29, that the language of spiritual and physical resurrection are used together in the same context. And thus the idea that resurrection in Revelation 20 must refer to physical resurrection is questionable. I actually think N.T. Wright, we kind of laughed when he looked at what he said, but I actually think he's correct there, because Revelation 20 is apocalyptic. But you may disagree. Meredith Klein's reading of the text is most persuasive. Klein suggests the following regarding Revelation 21 through 6. The first death is the physical death of the saints. Now the text doesn't specifically mention the first death, but it's implied, right? The first death is the physical death of the saints. The second death is the spiritual death of the wicked. So, in the same way, the first resurrection, says Klein, in the parallel, is the spiritual resurrection of the saints. And there's an implied second resurrection, the physical resurrection of the saints. So you have first and second. The text only mentions the first resurrection and the second death. But Klein points out that the first in Scripture often refers to the pre-consummated state. Thus there is a first Adam and a second Adam, a first covenant and a new covenant. So too in Revelation, the first resurrection is spiritual and preliminary to the second resurrection, which is physical and eternal. In a similar way, physical death is a prelude for the wicked of the second death, of eternal death. The word resurrection typically refers to physical resurrection, but it isn't surprising to find that the word is used symbolically in an apocalyptic book. The first resurrection refers to the intermediate state, to the life believers receive when they die in the Lord. John speaks of the souls of those who have been beheaded in 24, and thus it makes sense to see souls coming to life as referring to the intermediate state. We also see a reference to souls who are martyred in 6:9 through 11, and yet they're praying to the Lord for justice, which strengthens the case for a spiritual resurrection. The reigning for 1,000 years in an all-millennial reading is symbolic, and hence it isn't significant whether they reigned for the entire period. The point is that martyred believers triumph. I'm at the end. Last thing. Is the all-millennial interpretation convincing? I slightly prefer it. but I have doubts about it as well. When we consider all of Scripture, I think it is the best option, but it is difficult to be certain, and the premillennial view has many strengths as well. Fortunately, one's judgment on this matter isn't critical for the faith, and most believers assign too much significance to the millennial question. I have to admit, when I preached through Revelation, probably the most attention I ever got in social media was my sermon on that text, which I'm glad I didn't know about that in advance, because I had no idea what would happen. That was quite shocking to me. It isn't a weakness to admit that certainty is hard to come by, and there are good reasons to say that there are good arguments for both positions. Thank you.